Wonderful. So our second presentation is with Steve Byford, and the priority action was on bighorn sheep habitat restoration. There was a lot of concern and interest in high elevation grasslands. So Steve, if you want to go ahead and share your screen, and folks, you can turn your cameras off or leave them on. It's up to you. And I forgot to mention, if you hover to the top right, there's a view button, and you can go into speaker view, and then you're mostly seeing the speaker and their slides.
All right, just bear with me a little bit. I'm not used to doing this. Can everybody see the screen all right?
Not yet. So if
No?
you press, yeah, and no worries, I can always share your slides for you if you prefer. But if you go to that share screen button, first of all, open your PowerPoint on your desktop out of Zoom. And then when you press the share screen button, you should see your PowerPoint there as an option for the files.
And there we are. Oh.
There it is.
There it is.
Perfect. Thank you.
And slideshow from the beginning. Hello, slideshow. Sorry, folks. There. All right.
That slideshow from beginning. If you press that from beginning, that should do it. There it is.
There we go. Okay.
Perfect.
All right. So just as some backgrounder here, the bighorn sheep in the Elk Valley, there's really two distinct herds. One on the east side, on the coal mines primarily, and then a herd on the west side of the Elk Valley as well. And the herd on the west side is hasn't been doing that well compared to the ones on the east side. The east side populations are quite stable and are increasing, and on the west side the numbers have been declining from a high of probably 10 years ago, and now there's only probably about 75 to 80 animals left scattered over a fairly large area. And so there's also been not a great deal of work done on the west side of the Elk Valley in terms of either habitat or sheep movements or things of that nature compared to the funding that's been available for the east side. So in 2020, the Sparwood District Fish and Wildlife Association and the Elford Rod and Gun Club jointly applied for some HCPF funding and were successful in getting it to start to look at what's happening on the west side there. And part of that was to do some habitat assessments of the winter range, and that's the work that I've been doing for the last 2 summers. The sheep on the west side are overwintering right on the ridge tops, which is different from herds, say, in the Rocky Mountain Trench, where they're wintering down in the valley bottoms. And so most of our work has been up on the ridge tops. And so the study area stretches from Bruley Creek north all the way to Quarry Creek on the north end. So quite a large area, very rugged and remote. All of the work we did was fly in, fly out, and the sheep are using almost pocket type of winter ranges. There's probably 6 distinct winter ranges along that whole area there, and there's some question how much commingling actually happens between the sheep from one of those winter ranges to the next. And so those 75 animals are not necessarily all commingling. They're in smaller numbers that don't cross paths very often. And it's also worthy of noting that the northern end of the study area is inside Height of the Rockies provincial park. So the objectives of the project were to describe the winter range that the sheep are using, and then determine the condition of the habitat. Is it in proper functioning condition, or is it under stress? And is the winter range condition contributing to the low numbers, no population numbers on the west side? It's a qualitative assessment only, so we didn't do any quantitative work. And then to do finally make some recommendations for rehabilitation or enhancement if those were deemed to be appropriate. We only had 6 field days in each of the 2 seasons, so it was a very rough and ready approach that we took, but there were some interesting insights regardless. So first thing we needed to do is determine where the sheep are spending their winters. And in year 1, for the summer of 2020, the only information we had available to us was the wintering inventory work that the aerial surveys that are done annually by the ministry. And so we targeted our samples to where that overwintering inventory showed us individuals were spending some time. In the winter of January of 2021, 15 animals were collared and radio collared. And so that gave us much better information for determining where the animals are spending their winters, and we were able to focus our sampling much more specifically. And there's an example of kind of the radio telemetry data that we had available to us, and then we could focus our sampling on that. So we did our best to predetermine where we were going to sample rather than just pick and choose once we got in the field. But there were some modifications made once we got in the field. Obviously, practicalities, we couldn't get to some places and whatnot. And then we used roughly the same methodology that was used on the east side on the coal mines. We used the BC Rangeland Health Guide and something called the Upland Functional Checklist to do a ranking and determination of the condition of the range once we got out there. So what we found was that Bighorn over the two seasons, and this past summer's work is I'm still working on kind of coalescing it, but the sheep are using a wide variety of habitats in winter, from essentially rock cliffs to in some cases, very good quality fescue grasslands where you'd expect to find them. We found that the plant communities generally across all the ranges were found to be in proper functioning condition, with some local exceptions in Crossing Creek, which I'll show you a picture of in a minute. One of the interesting things that we found was that the fescue dominated grasslands, which are typically where you would find sheep in the wintertime, are uncommon on the west side. They're restricted really to the slopes of Mount Ingram in Forsyth Creek and the Crossing Creek ridges, and the quality fescue grasslands are associated with deeper, finer textured soils, which are typically associated with shale, with weathered shale deposits, which weather quite finely, as opposed to the limestone derived soils, which is on the majority of the rest of the ranges that we looked at. They're spending their time, much of their time on or near the ridge tops at very high elevation, where the forage quality is not great. The last picture, by the way, that's Mount Ingram. That's some of the high quality fescue grasslands that we did see there, and sheep are using those where they're available, but in a lot of cases the habitats they're using are quite marginal in terms of the forage value. So they're spending quite a bit of time in alpine tundra and alpine grassland habitats that are predominant on most of the ranges, and those habitats are dominated by mountain avens and sedges with only scattered bunch grasses, and so the amount of forage that we were seeing that's available to them is much less than what you'd expect on either on the east side, on the coal mine side, or for instance in the Coogee Valley where they winter down lower. And here's an example of some of the localized impacts that we did see. Those were on key landscape features. They're typically only a tenth of a hectare at the most in size, and they're places. And this is Crossing Creek Ridge again. You can see that the soils are purplish. They're from weathered shales, similar to kind of a Waterton type of shale rock. And so I'm going to say ungulates rather than just sheep, because some of this damage could be from goats as well, because they do commingle on the same locations as far as I could tell. And so there were a few localized spots where there's been some grazing impacts on the habitats. So one of the things we did do as a result of the recommendations from the 2020 work is recommend that we deploy some grazing exclusion cages on the ranges. There's some deficiencies, if you want, or some issues with using the methodology that we use on lower elevation grasslands at high elevation, and part of that is that we don't know what the benchmark proper functioning condition looks like or is described as in the alpine tundra and alpine grasslands. And so we're not sure what we're looking at there is a climax condition, or whether there should be more, for instance, Idaho fescue or alpine fescues in these grasslands. And so the cages should, over the next few years, give us some indication of whether there's any vegetation shifts, plant community shifts, or not, as a result of the grazing that does occur at high elevation. So our recommendations and collaboration opportunities so far are to monitor the grazing exclusion cages, which I just mentioned, for the next several years. Consider fecal pellet analysis to better understand the diet of the sheep on the west side, where we didn't find extensive fescue dominated grassland. And then, because these are all high elevation areas, there's really limited opportunities for rehabilitation, because the sites are so harsh in terms of the growing conditions, and also the propensity for the sheep and goats to want to concentrate on key landscape features, probably where the wind is blowing the snow away, and so they're focusing on those, and you can't really keep them off there. So future enhancement activities, which we'll be recommending in our final report, likely should be focused on those few areas where we do have higher forage potential on the deeper soils on Crossing Creek and Mount Ingram, rather than on the marginal sites that we're finding it in the tundra. And then last year in particular, well, there's been quite a bit of work, as I mentioned, done on the coal mine side, on the east side. And last summer there was quite a BioBlitz led by Emily Cameron from the Conservation Data Center. She collected a lot of information and also put crews on the west side as well. And that would complement the work that we've done over the last couple of years. Hers is far more intensive work as well. She's done some vet plots and whatnot. And so there's a real opportunity to share knowledge with her group and combine it and get a better picture of what's happening on the west side there in terms of habitat. And so that'll be one of the recommendations, is we somehow connect with her and share data, back and forth, and then come up with a more comprehensive snapshot of what we've got out there. And then lastly, BC Parks has been very supportive in the activities up inside the park in Corey and Forsyth, and hopefully they'll continue to be supportive perhaps also be an active funding partner sometime in the future. And yeah, so just one last slide that is in part of Crossing Creek, and so that little bench land way out on the far right skyline there is one of our plots, and that's typically where you would find the clusters of telemetry data points, and then assess the nearby grassland. So there you go. That's a brief snapshot of what we've been up to. And open for questions.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Steve. If you stop sharing your screen and people turn their videos on, we'll see everyone. We probably just have time for one question or so. If anybody has a question, they can either put their hand up or pop it in the chat box. So you just have, there should be a stop share.
I'm working on it. Oh,
yeah. Good old technology.
Sorry, folks. I'm just not very good at doing it.
That's fine.
No, that's not it. Oh, way up top, maybe. Let's see here.
If you hover around, there should be a stop share. Is it in the shares? There it
go.
is. You found it. Wonderful.
Oh, yeah.
And if everyone goes into gallery view, we'll see each other again. Does anyone have a question for Steve? Oh, Bill?
Yep. Thanks, Steve. Great to see some progress on this. I don't have a question at the moment, but just more of a an update. Bighorn sheep are kind of on the cusp of being put on limited entry in the region. That's a recommendation for the next hunting regulation cycle. I think it's going to have an enormous impact on sheep across the province. How it's going to shift pressure. And I think we need to have a comprehensive sheep management plan, which I don't think we have. We have a sheep report. Again, another reaction to declining population by the BC government, as opposed to having a management plan that's going to not only ensure the health of the population and the habitat, which is first and foremost, but also continued hunting opportunity that is going to probably be under our current limited entry system in British Columbia, which could be the end to, like the sheep hunting in BC, just the beginning, not the end of it, but guys like Clayton will never have an opportunity to hunt bighorns again under our current limited entry system if we're allowed these populations to decrease so much that they can't sustain the hunting opportunity. And just the conservation efforts by the Rod and Gun Clubs, BC Wildlife Federation, backcountry hunters and anglers, and other conservation groups to ensure that we have access management, we have habitat management, we have a diversity of hunting opportunity that's going to spread the pressure out. Hopefully some legislative changes, but it's going to be a big discussion that's going to be happening this winter. And it's unfortunate that we've gotten to the point where we're just starting to find out what's wrong with the habitat. Again, another reaction to limited entry hunting by BC government as opposed to proactive management. And again, it's, I'll mention that Fish and Wildlife Habitat Coalition, which is trying to encourage the Together for Wildlife strategy, the Minister's Wildlife Advisory Council, to start making these plans so that we can move forward and have an actual plan for wildlife in the future, and not just continue to react to it as we have more and more impacts on their habitat. Thanks, Steve.
Thanks for that update, Bill. Marcy, did you have a question?
Yeah, thanks for your presentation, Steve. Two questions. One, I'm wondering if you could tell us approximately how many bighorn sheep are in that population on the west side. And then secondly, when you showed us the Crossing Creek slide, it looked like mountain goat habitat. So I'm wondering what the dynamics are between the bighorn sheep and mountain goats in that sort of limited habitat. Thanks.
Yeah. So in terms of the what's happening with goats and sheep, again, I'm just a habitat guy. I'm not a sheep biologist. the goats and sheep are sharing very similar habitats there. And, you know, in some regards, the sheep are acting like goats in terms of wintering on the ridgetops there. And so I have had some conversations with Eileen Fescue and others about whether there is some what kind of interaction is happening between goats and sheep on those habitats, again, where the landscape features are being used probably because those are areas that are being blown clear of snow, and so they're going to be preferred by both sheep and goats when they're up on the ridgetops. The goat population, I understand, is healthy or increasing on that side, and I don't know in terms of whether one's more aggressive than the other. I suspect the goats are probably more aggressive than the sheep in terms of maybe pushing them around, and that could lead to some stresses in terms of their energy budgets through the winter as well. But I'm not the right person to be speaking to that.
Thank you. Oh,
no, that's good. Did I answer both parts of your question, or just the second part?
The first part was just if you knew an approximate number of bighorns that are in the west.
Yeah, so on the west side, the most recent information I have is that there's 75 to 80 animals scattered over that fairly large area, and that's down from a high of probably in the order of 125 animals, say 10 years ago. And certainly below what's considered to be the carrying capacity for the ranges, which would be in the order of about 100 animals, something like that. Right?
Thank you, Steve. That was a great presentation. We really appreciate it.